Okay, let's talk about carbohydrates, which is one of the four major groups of organic molecules that we are going to find in the human body, well, in organisms, but obviously since this is human A and P, that's going to be our main focus. So carbohydrates are basically defined by the ratio of hydrogen and oxygen molecules that we find in the molecule. And what we're going to find typically is that there's going to be a 2-to-1 ratio of hydrogen to oxygen molecules. What we see in these pictures here is that we see that these carbohydrates can be found as what we call monomers These monomers are individual molecules. All right, so three examples that are given are glucose, galactose, and fructose. In fact, if we looked and counted all these up, we should see that we all have a C6H12O6 molecular formula. So what these are, then these are all structural isomers, meaning they have the same molecular formula, but yet they're structurally, they are different. Now what can happen is we can take those monomers and we can join them together via an anabolic reaction, specifically one called dehydration synthesis. And we can join these together to make what we call dimers. Now, because we're talking about carbohydrates, these monomers of carbohydrates are called monosaccharides. Dimers of carbohydrates are called disaccharides. And what we see here is sucrose, which is table sugar, lactose, which is the sugar in milk, and then maltose, which I believe is the sugar that you find in malted grains and things like that for making beer and barley-based malted beverages. Let's talk briefly about some of the chemical properties of carbohydrates. They're typically going to be very sweet tasting. Because they are sugars and starches. They are what we call hydrophilic, which means water-loving in Greek. Hydro, water, philic mean love, and that means that they are able to dissolve in water. And part of that relates to the fact that they have polar covalent bonds. We know that things with polar covalent bonds will dissolve in things that have polar covalent bonds, like water. Function. All right, so what's the function of these carbohydrates besides tasting yummy and sweet and good? These are basically our energy storage molecules for the body. A lot of energy within carbohydrates. Some are structural components within the body, within cells. Some can be connected to lipids and proteins to make what we call glycoproteins and glycolipids. And these would then be some type of structural component. Those are the main functions then. All right. The other thing then is if we have more than two monomers that are joined together, and we're talking about carbohydrates, those would be called what we call polysaccharides, meaning more than one sugar joined together. And what we're looking at here is a very common polysaccharide found stored in human muscle in the liver called glycogen. And it is essentially glucose molecules that are joined together by an oxygen molecule here. They're joined together, and it formed a very long branched chain of sugars. And these are important. This is energy storage, and the cells can break off the individual glycogen molecules and use those to generate ATP for the cell. Plants don't store glycogen. What they do is they store chains, not branch chains, but just long chains of sugars, glucose sugars, and others as well. And those long branch chains are called starch. And we can break those starches down. We get those are plant sugars. The other thing that's found in plants, which are polysaccharides, are things called cellulose. And those have a little bit of a different structural organization, but they too are made with carbohydrates. They are polysaccharides. And this is really, when we talk about the fiber that we need in our diet, that's what that is. That's the cellulose, the plant fibers. We do not have the enzymes to break down those bonds between those sugars. In fact, that's one of the things that scientists are working on, is finding a way to break down very cheaply and easily the bonds between the cellulose so that yeast can ferment those sugars into alcohol, which then can be distilled into ethanol. It's a whole biofuels project that scientists around the world are working on.